Hey everyone, it's Simi Shah, and welcome to Trailblazers. On this podcast, I dive deep into the journeys of trailblazing South Asians, sharing the stories of the leaders and dreamers lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. We have a special episode for you today with none other than Brinda Adhikari, executive producer and showrunner of The Problem with Jon Stewart. This new Apple TV show marks the famed Jon Stewart's return to television as he tackles a new societal issue in every episode. And Brinda is at the helm. Brinda joined The Problem from CBS News, where she was a senior broadcast producer for segments anchored by major TV personalities like Norah O'Donnell and Scott Pelley. Brinda's career in broadcast TV actually began at ABC News, where she started as a researcher and rose the ranks to become a producer on World News Tonight with Diane, Sawyer, and David Muir. She spent over a decade at the outlet. Brinda is unlike any other guest we've had on Trailblazers to date, and I am so thrilled to speak with her today. Welcome, Brinda.
Thanks, Simi. I'm scared that I'm unlike anyone else. My mother, she'll probably be like, it's because you chose the arts.
Well, honestly, this is a question that I had planned for you, and we can jump ahead now, but when we think about South Asian representation in the entertainment industry, the first lens we think of it through is on screen. We don't think of it through the production lens of what's going on behind the scenes, who's behind the scenes. And so I'm actually genuinely curious what your experience has been in this field, because you're one of the few prominent South Asians in this realm that I came across. And I'm curious, have you felt represented? Have you felt like one of the odd ones out? And how have you seen this dynamic change over the 20-something years that you've been in the industry?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I would say for sure there's not a lot of people that look like us in what I do. But as I look at the more junior levels and the more middle levels and things like that, it's definitely something that I feel like there are some more faces. And truthfully, I think partly it's from our community. I don't know that we necessarily encourage TV production in a big way. Of course, it's systemic, and people of color in general have not had a lot of opportunities in many industries. But in general, I don't meet a lot of Indian Americans who want to be showrunners.
Yeah.
But that said, it's not, I think, because they don't want to do it or that they can't do it, certainly.
Yeah.
It's that it's not a story we tell as much in our community. But I think it's getting better. I think for sure it's getting better. And, we have a couple of Desis on our staff, and it's something that I hope to see flourish.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear. And I think in that vein, I want to take it back to the beginning of your story, because I know you graduated, you go to work as a communications consultant for UNICEF, and the next thing I know, you're a researcher at ABC News. Did you always knew you wanted to go into TV? Tell me a little bit about that journey and how you ended up at ABC.
So I have always had a passion for politics and history and government. It's something I majored in college. My dad was a journalist, and, at home we had some pretty fantastic debates constantly. The kinds of people I grew up around were incredibly just interested in the world. And so I always grew up with that sort of a motivation. But really, as you know, when you graduate from college, maybe you don't know because you went to Harvard, and but the rest of us, you graduate and you kind of see like what there is out there.
Yeah.
And I taught English for a little while.
Wow.
I just did all kinds of stuff. But really, my heart was always in telling stories. And I get really passionate and outraged about stuff. And I was sort of listening to that. And for UNICEF, basically my job was to take journalists around to different projects that the UN was doing. And I just had this moment where I was like, I want someone to take me around because I want to tell those stories, and it sounds like that's the more fun thing for me. And truthfully, I had a good friend from college, one of my best friends. This is so roundabout, but her boyfriend's brother was a journalist. And we all went out for dinner one night, and we got to talking about Middle Eastern politics. And he was like, you seem like you're into this stuff and you know a few things. And he was just like, I know somebody looking for an assistant at ABC News.
Wow.
I applied and it turned out to be an assistant slash sort of researcher role. And then it was off to the races, man.
Wow. Super, super interesting. Now, can you tell me a little bit about what that initial role was like? I know you were a researcher for ABC's investigative news unit. What exactly did that entail?
So it was soon after 9/11. So everything was very focused on counterterrorism. And it
Okay.
was that time when like every story was about this cell was broken in London and this thing was
Wow.
happening and this place being funded by. So a lot of my job was to basically keep track of all of the counterterrorism stories. And that was our biggest focus at the time. And so a lot of my job, I would have like databases of people and places and stories about funding and cells and whatever. But the thing that really I found interesting, like it was interesting to do that, but I found it was in some ways a little myopic. And I was really interested in systems and I was interested in sort of figuring out how we got there in the first place. And I never stopped feeling that. When you're an assistant and when you're a researcher, you don't get a lot of agency in what you're doing. So you're doing the job and you're doing what you got to do. And I will say that I definitely cut my teeth in just research skills. And that's something that I will say to anybody, which is like, no matter what you want to do in your life, gain skills
Yeah.
because it just makes you somebody that people feel like they can go to for things. It's not just about what you want to do, but it's also about what people see in you. So for me, it was really useful because I gained a lot of just basic research skills, Nexus and just all this stuff, trying to find records and FOIA and all this stuff.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, based on my understanding, and I will tell you right now that a lot of my understanding these days is from watching the morning show, where I feel like I've first
Mm.
gotten the glimpse into what production behind the scenes looks like, though I'm sure that's obviously an over dramatized version of it. It seems like there's a very clear hierarchy. You start out as an assistant or a researcher and then you work your way
Mm.
up the ranks, which is really what you did at ABC News. Can you talk a little bit about how exactly that happened? And as you move through those roles, how did you really realize this is a world that you wanted to stay in?
Yeah. It's a hierarchy, but it's a journey. It's one where you can, if you decide to stay in the industry, there are these like plot points that you can see very clearly. I imagine it's the same in any industry, but the one I know is this one. And
Yeah.
truthfully, for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a print reporter. I was like, I'm above TV, like I'm like Woodward Bernstein. That's what I'm going to do. And the fact is, you find yourself in a thing and you just end up kind of getting okay at it, and then you keep doing it and you keep doing it. Then it feels good to be kind of good at something. And then you sort of forget about that thing that you necessarily were like, that's what I'm going to do. Because then you end up getting good at something and you're like, oh, it feels good to be good at something. And
Yeah.
that really was what had happened for me. I don't think I truly got like bitten by the bug until much later
Wow.
when I was a producer and I got to really pitch stories and see them through. At my more junior level, I think I was like, all right, well, I'm in this and I don't know what else I'm going to do. And it's fun, but I'm not sure, all those things. I think it's mainly that once you figure out where it is you want to go, the path becomes clearer in a way.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I was like, I think I want to make stories. I want to tell people stories and I want to be able to affect change in my own little way. But mainly, I just love the act of producing, the act of picking up the phone and making calls and kind of bringing together teams of people and figuring out what each person's going to do and figuring out the things out there that sort of made us mad and wanting to do stories about them. And in media, we're all sort of type A, and it was nice to find like a common community, it was just really
Yeah.
fun. Like I just made so many friends who were cut from the same cloth that we were like
Yep.
obsessed with current events and we talked too loudly and we interrupted a lot. We had terrible social skills. But then eventually it just got to a point where I was like, it was beyond just journalism. I began to get really excited about the concept of leading a team.
Yeah.
And then I got to a place where I was like, what can I do with that?
Yeah. And something that I find interesting that you just touched on, there was a part of you that envisioned yourself orienting more towards print journalism than broadcast journalism. What do you think are the key differences and what made you choose one over the other?
Well, at its most base level, I think you can get pretty in depth with print stories that with broadcast, you're often not given the same opportunity to be able to write a 2,000 word essay on something, or even any article, whether it's, New York Times, San Antonio Express, LA Times, whatever, like you're just able to get a little bit more in depth. And I've always been jealous of that for print. In terms of why, I don't know that I did choose broadcast. I sort of fell into it. And I think it was one of those things where at the time, if someone was like, there's an opportunity at the Washington Post, like really early on, I probably would have been like, yeah. But then I just got to a place where I really appreciated the platform that TV could give people. I also appreciated that there was something about the pace of it that I really enjoyed. There's something
Yeah.
about the teamworkness. Like you're not just writing a piece and doing it on your own. Like it's such a team sport. Anytime you see anybody in TV news, there's like 7 people along with them that have done the thing. And
Yeah.
I just began to really enjoy that collaboration. I've always loved being a part of a team. I love team sports. I loved in college, I was in a dance company. We were part of a
Yeah.
team. I just like teams, and I
Yeah.
began to realize that TV is a real team sport. And I love that part.
Yeah. I find that really interesting because I think when you think of journalism, obviously you consider the newsroom, but generally it feels like something very individualistic. So hearing that TV kind of offered you that duality where you could find the team environment in this field where that's a little bit rarer is super, super interesting because I don't think it's something that people realize very often.
Yeah. I don't know enough about print journalism. I think you get a community and a team there too. Absolutely. But I think you, like so many places, when you find yourself having fun with doing something, you end up just being like, I want to keep having this feeling. And for me, that was it. I was just having a lot of fun and I didn't want to stop that feeling. And then I got to a point where I was doing stories that I really cared about. And some of them affected like little bits and pieces of change here and there. And it's so thrilling to know that you can kind of platform somebody that way, but also that you have your own little perch from which you can do something. And you
Yeah.
just have to realize you have it.
Yeah. Did you ever consider being an anchor?
For like 3 hot seconds in my life, and everybody feels this way when they're in TV news, they're like, I can be on air. No, but then I quickly gave that notion up because I think honestly, on air reporters are, holy moly, that is a grind. And they're fantastic, but it is such hard work. And I really appreciated it. There's also like a fearlessness that they have that I don't know that I do. And truthfully, I really just did become really fascinated with the art of putting together a story.
Yeah.
It was fun to work with a reporter. I don't know what it was. I just, some point, the idea of like seeing myself on screen or something kind of made me incredibly anxious. So I was like, maybe I should listen to that and
Yeah.
move away and go
Wow.
behind the screen.
So another thing that you just touched on, I'm not sure that people generally fully understand what a producer does. So can you share a little bit about what exact responsibilities come with that sort of role?
Yeah. I think it probably varies from place to place, but in news, for me, I kind of view a producer as like a jack of all trades. In my view, what I looked for, somebody who was editorial, so they sort of knew what the story was. They'll get assigned a story or they'll pitch a story, they'll write the pitch, they'll figure out how do I translate these words onto something that ends up being a 7-minute, 2-minute, hour-long story.
Sure.
So they think about who the characters are that they're going to tell it. So who are the people that they're going to call to be on screen or on background on experts to get them more information? How are they going to shoot the story? So you try to figure out the look and you try to think about the actual vision for how you translate words into pictures. So you're then beginning to think which camera crews are able to achieve this in a way that I like. You think about the voice of the correspondent and you talk to them and you think about ways in which
Wow.
their vision and your vision are then combined and translated. You think about graphics, you think about the location. You're kind of project managing,
Yeah.
but you're also a creative and editorial driver of that whole project.
Yeah.
So really, you are the kind of captain of the story is how I view a producer. You are the hub. You are the person that people go to as like the place where they figure out how all those pieces come together. You're a chef. and you're working with all these ingredients and you're the one who's going to kind of chop them up and put them together. But
Yeah.
you're also the person who is leaning on a lot of other people to make sure that they're doing their jobs. Your job is to kind of make sure all the trains are running, and then you see it through the air.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it sounds like it requires just a ton of skills that combine together to offer this real production value.
Yeah, I think so. I think being somebody who can both be calm and level headed, but also know when you got to kind of light a fire under people to get things done, you have to know deadlines. You have to be somebody who sort of knows when to say no and when to encourage people to tease out an idea. It's a real calibration. Like you're kind of keeping all these pistons moving at the same time. And
Yeah.
you have to be disciplined, but also be a pretty good leader, I think, in that role. And yeah, it's something I've always enjoyed. Like in some ways, I've always thought that producers plan weddings really well because a wedding is a massive production when you think about it.
Yeah.
So like you're just doing all of these things together to create this experience and to create this product.
I appreciate the metaphor around weddings because I used to work in finance, and people actually say that a ton about people that work in finance because they're so good at Excel and just you have to be hyper organized. But no, I appreciate you sharing that lens into what production actually involves because it's not something that I think I or others have fully understood over the course of our lives. I want to trek back to your specific experiences because they're so fascinating. And when I think of the world of entertainment, I compare it to moving to LA and trying to get that big break in Hollywood. And here you are, and you start out at ABC, one of the most prominent news outlets, and then you go to CBS. And now you're the showrunner for The Problem with Jon Stewart. And I know you spent a number of years at all these organizations, but still, it's pretty incredible. So, can you walk me through some of those milestones? And particularly, I want to hear about what compelled your decision to leave ABC and go to CBS after spending over a decade there.
Yeah. I think it was like 12 years, actually. It was bananas. I loved it. I loved ABC. I loved my time there. Like I said, at some point, I began to think about leadership and I began to think about not only am I interested in journalism and interested in all this great content, but I really like the idea of leading a team and where are spaces where I can do that. And at the time, an opportunity presented itself at CBS to be a senior producer for the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley. And I really admired Scott Pelley. And the executive producer at the time was Steve Kappas, who also is sort of this legend in the industry. And
Yep.
I was like, oh, it's so cool to kind of work with them. And in my job interviews, for me, it's really important to just get a good feeling for the place I work in. And also, like, I don't know, I'm kind of a quirky, weird person. And I want to make sure that people accept me for who I am in some ways, you know? And it just felt
Wow.
like I had a great job interview where I really could sort of be myself. And that was super fun. So I left ABC mainly because I just felt like this was such a good opportunity to sort of learn from some pretty amazing people and also to get a chance to try my hand at being in a slightly more leadership space. And so it was tough. It's always tough when you leave a place after so long, you know, everybody
Yeah.
you know, and all the 12 years is like a long time to be in a place. But I did it. And in some ways, it was a big jump, but it also didn't feel quite so dramatic because I went from one evening news show to another evening news show. And there are similarities in terms of how all that works. But culturally, it's a CBS and ABC felt pretty different. But I felt good about that. And I learned so much. And I worked with all these different anchors at CBS and different executive producers. And I love the producers and the team we were working with there. But yeah, I think that as I kept going, I realized that I really enjoyed not just my one story that I was working on, but I really loved the idea of thinking about how a whole show was put together. And I began to really think about that. And I really enjoyed seeing what an executive producer did and sort of zooming out and seeing, okay, well, how do all of these stories together make a show? It
Yeah.
was weird. Like when there was a fire we had to put out, those were like my favorite times. I really enjoyed the like crazy of some crazy problem and puzzle we had to figure out, some crazy breaking news situation that we all had to like, all hands on deck, we got to jump on it. And
Can you give me an example?
oh my gosh, there's so many, Simi. I can't even. I mean, there's obviously the really terrible dark ones of wildfires and mass shootings and all those things. But I remember when Trump fired Comey, like in a moment, we all just kind of looked at each other. We're like, wait, did that just happen? And we sort of jumped into it, and it just became this incredible sight to behold of sort of seeing what was happening and then feeling like you really had a responsibility to get the story right, to make sure that you were calling out like this is abnormal, and then
Yeah.
just seeing all the pieces of it come together. I think when the Mueller report came out, that was also something that was just a big moment where I remember just being in the control room and kind of making sure that everybody was in their places, kind of the reporter at the Justice Department, the graphics, making sure people were reading it, all that stuff. So, yeah, there's just moments where you're getting this front row seat to history and you want to make sure that you're there for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, in a world where breaking news and news generally is incessant and everything is politicized, how have you tried to cut through the noise?
Great question. Because I think the motivation always has to be facts and truth. And I think that can make a person go above the desire to fall into partisan traps. And I don't know that I've always succeeded in that. I think I very much take responsibility for falling into those traps. But that's the goal I always have. You really just look at a set of facts and ultimately you go with where the evidence is leading you. And whether that benefits one party or the other should never be your guiding principle.
Yeah.
It really should be at some point you're doing this because it just makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that at its best, media and journalism has sort of been that, has been the thing that is able to separate the clarity from the noise. But I do think that the pressures of the industry, the financial pressures of the industry, the ratings pressures of the industry have sometimes forced folks to make choices that feel like they're trying to appease interests, then
Yep.
go for that. And that's been tough to see. And I've been a part of that too. I'm not any better than anybody else. So at the end of the day, I think the goal is always to make sure that you're sort of prosecuting a case in a way that is exposing corruption and hypocrisy, and that the people who are really suffering or feeling that injustice are the ones whose voices are really being heard. But honestly, I feel like I haven't always done a good job of that, and you always hope to strive for that.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate you being candid in that respect because I don't think people typically are willing to admit to that. It's no secret that the streaming wars have begun. Apple TV is one that's obviously gaining prominence with new shows like The Problem with Jon Stewart. I'm curious, did that and this ratings pressure that you're talking about and the fact that all these new streaming giants are emerging one after the other, did that factor into your decision to pivot out of ABC and CBS and now work on this new project?
I really just didn't understand too much about the world, to be honest, like in terms of Netflix, Amazon, and Apple and all this stuff. I mean, certainly Apple is Apple and they have their reputation, and that was interesting and cool just to see what that looks like. But to be frank, I mean, it was the Jon Stewart part of it that was really
Yeah.
the big selling point for me. I think it's interesting to feel like you're part of a nonlinear platform where it's not about people tuning in and the ratings aren't. I mean, certainly metrics, I'm sure, matter a lot to people, but it was such a driving force in the work that I've done my whole life that it was sort of interesting to work in a place where content is king and you're really just going for that.
Wow.
And that part was really exciting to me. And that they really trust John to tell the story and to work with somebody who's getting so much trust and so much runway to be able to do that was super exciting to me.
Yeah. So tell me, how do you get tapped for a role like this?
Well, so it all started. It was like fall of, I don't even know the year, 2020. Yes. And at that time I had been at CBS for 5 years. I'd been at ABC for 12 years. And I was sort of like, all right, well, I knew that I wanted to be a showrunner. I knew that I wanted to be an executive producer because at the time I'd sort of had a couple of stints in filling in for some EPs and I really loved it. I really enjoyed the job. And I was like, all right, I think it's time for me to see like, where can I be an executive producer? Who will have me? And I started just having meetings and things like that with people and got some pretty positive responses in the news world. But then somebody I know called me and was just like, so this is going to sound kind of weird, but Jon Stewart is starting up this current affairs show. And I thought I'd put your name in the ring. And I was like, what? Jon Stewart? You know, the guy who like challenged news and made fun of news for all those years. Why would he want to have anything to do with me? But, you know, I respected him so much, and so many people in the news do. They do respect him a lot.
Absolutely.
And so I was like, well, I can't pass up that opportunity. I didn't really think too hard on it. I was like, oh, sure. But I didn't think that anything would come of it, because I sort of, like you do when you have all these presumptions of, you know, oh, he's going to go with somebody who's in comedy. He's going to go with somebody he knows, like all that stuff. And so I sort of put my name in there, and I didn't really think twice about it. And then like a week or two later, they were like, oh, you know, his production company wants to talk to you. And I was like, oh, cool. Okay. So I had a conversation, and it wasn't with him at the time. It was with these two people at Busboy. And it was such a fun conversation. Like it was like 45 minutes, and we laughed, we talked about things that mattered to us, and we just clicked. It was just a super fun, like the three of us had a really fun conversation. But at the end of it, I still was like, this just seems so not possible.
Wow.
And I sort of hung up. And then a couple of days later, I get a message saying that Jon Stewart wants to talk to you. And I was like, okay. And they set up a Zoom, and we have a conversation with a couple of people from Busboy and John. And it was a fantastic conversation. I think it lasted almost 2 hours.
Wow.
And we talked about everything under the sun, but we really just talked about where we're coming from on things, about news, about content in general. And I think what I realized was we didn't feel quite as differently about things as I thought we would, given what he's done at The Daily Show, and me kind of been in his, you know, target practice for The Daily Show for all those years. But at the same time, I think that that was a mistake on my part to think that that was his aim from The Daily Show too. Like, he and I both strongly believe in the role of the press and how important it is. And he has tremendous respect for the press. But I do think that in that respect comes a desire to see bullshit called out. And when it's not, I think he wants to put a pin on that and figure out like, okay, how do we make that better?
Wow.
So yeah, and then that led to another conversation. And before you know it, I get an offer for the role. And I was stunned. It was something that I was not expecting. But when something feels right, it almost feels easy. The conversations were easy.
Yep.
Just myself with his team, myself with him. It just felt like we were kind of thinking the same way about things. And even when we weren't thinking the same way about things, we were sort of approaching things from a similar value space.
Yeah. Well, obviously, major congratulations. I know this was a big week for you guys at the launch and everything, but super, super exciting to see someone like you at the helm of the show.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm curious, this is your first experience being an EP, being a showrunner. What are some of the big changes that come with stepping into that role?
You mean from news to comedy, or just in general?
Just in general, and then I do want to talk about the comedic element.
Yeah. I think the big part of it is that now you're sort of responsible for an entire team of people, and you are thinking about things not just from the sort of space of like the one story you're responsible for telling, or even the 2 or 3 stories you're responsible for overseeing, but an entire process. You're having to be kind of an ambassador for the process. What's cool is, you know, John is very much an EP on the show as well. And he and I are partners in this. And it's been so interesting working with Apple and working with our team and working with comedy writers and news people and all that stuff. But that's, I think, just been the biggest change. Is it's just a lot more.
Yeah.
You're in charge of a lot more things. And it's really just making sure that you're not getting too in the weeds of any one thing, but you're both being focused and paying attention to the things that need to be paid attention to. But then you're also able to kind of quickly zoom out and say, okay, what needs to happen next? It's been so much fun. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it so much. It's truly such a privilege to do it.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I said, like a really energizing and exciting role. I think the other part of it that seems interesting to me, just based on your background, is there's a couple of new facets to this. It's the comedic element, which is not something that you've done before, but also I noticed that you guys are putting out a newsletter, you're putting out a podcast. I'm curious what it's been like to take on all these different challenges and that too, kind of working on the Jon Stewart comeback.
Yeah. Oh, it's been so much fun. I think the thing for us that's felt so exciting is that we really have been given so much creative freedom to pursue something that we want to do. So it's felt like we're kids in a sandbox and we're building these sandcastles or whatever. That was like a terrible analogy, but
No, it's good.
I think you understand. But I think we've really approached it from a place of how can we tell something really good? How can we make something great? We haven't necessarily even approached it from like, how can we make the funniest iteration or the most journalistic iteration? We've really been like, what is something that really pisses us off? And how do we crack it? How do we crack the way of telling the story of why does it piss us off? What is the thing that pisses us off? What is the tool with which we can tell that story the best, whether it is comedic or some other way of saying it? But we haven't gone into it being too burdened by labels. I think the good thing about Jon is he's able to tell so many different kinds of stories.
Yeah.
And that's a gift he has. And rather than feel like we need to put him in any sort of box, we're really leaning into the fact that he can use this skill he has in so many different spaces. So I'd say it's because we've hired people who are so good at all these different things. It hasn't felt like Jon and I have to sort of start from scratch. You know, we have an incredibly talented digital team, an incredible writers room.
Yeah.
We have journalists who've worked with us from the New York Times to ABC, CBS, NBC, to just all these different spaces of expertise. And it's sort of been like, what is a way in which we can meet people where they are right now, which is
Yep.
consuming things from such a 360-degree place? And how can that best amplify the kind of storytelling we want to do? So it's been super exciting to think about.
What do you view as the vision for this show? What indicates success for you?
The vision for the show is we look into something that I think most people would agree is a problem. And we look at why do people think of this as a problem? And we look at who are the people that this problem is affecting? And then what's standing in the way of getting some sort of change on it?
Yeah.
That's really it. And it's amplifying the voices of the people doing the work so that rather than feel the hubris of like, and now we've come up with a solution to climate change, I think it's really looking at it as what is the best way that we can tell an interesting story about something that we feel really emotional about as a society, but then do it in a way with all these tools that we have, which is comedy, which is journalism, which is documentary skills, which is podcasting and newsletters and tweets and TikToks and all of these things. But our North Star is really what is something that gets a visceral reaction out of people, and how do we look at ways in which we can kind of zoom into it to figure out why does it make us mad?
Yeah.
And who does it really hurt when it's a problem?
Yeah.
So for Jon, I think that's been his sort of superhero strength for years, which is like to call out corruption and hypocrisy
Yep.
in the halls of power. So that's kind of the goal.
Absolutely. You've worked with some of the foremost personalities in TV, from Diane Sawyer to Norah O'Donnell, now Jon Stewart. What has that been like?
They're all like wonderful people who I've had such great experiences with professionally and have learned so much from. I'm really fascinated by people who are given the responsibility of carrying this whole storytelling thing on their shoulders, or I think that it's a really tough job that they have. And I feel like one of the things I've been able to do is to sort of engage with them just about that.
Yeah.
What it means to use that skill and how can you tell the story in the best way that reaches people in a really impactful way. But it's really fun working with reporters and working with journalists and working with just personalities who I think feel really excited and inspired to tell those stories. And I think what's great is that now, in being empowered in this role, I think I get an even closer look at the person who's kind of been tasked with being the voice of our show. And I mean, he's the best, like
Yeah.
he's so great. And it's so fun working with him.
Yeah.
It's been such a joy. Honestly, it's been just the biggest joy of my professional life.
Wow.
It's something that we have so much fun in the office as a team. We have fun on Zoom, but we take this platform that we have very seriously because we know that there is a lot of excitement about John and
Yeah.
being away and all that stuff. But truthfully, we view it as like, how can we kind of take advantage of that to tell these stories that matter a lot to us?
Yeah. Wow. What's the hardest part of the job?
Well, there's certainly a lot of expectations around John. And managing that has been really interesting. I think the hardest part is just making sure that we are staying focused and disciplined and not getting too overwhelmed with all the noise around us.
Yeah.
I've never been part of a show that quite has this level of interest and expectation around it. And it's so easy to go into that rabbit hole of what expectations. Is it The Daily Show? Is it not The Daily Show? Is it like this person? Is it not like this person? Is John funny? Is he not funny? Like all this stuff. And ultimately, you just want to be like, we've been given this gift to be able to work on something that we care so deeply about. And I view my job as just keeping that ship sailing and doing it to the best of my ability,
Absolutely.
And sometimes that can be easier to do than others, particularly around a launch. It can be like, whoa, what's this person saying? What's that person saying? And just to kind of not get too bogged down by all that.
Yep.
Like in any other job I've had, and certainly it's not like I'm completely ignorant of what it means to work in a space where people are interested in what you're doing. Because even, you work with someone like Diane or Scott Pelley or whoever, like there is interest there, but like nowhere near this level. And I think truthfully, the most fun part of it has really been when we just get to kind of be with our team and John and hashing things out and brainstorming and saying, what about this? What about this? And it really is, it's so fun.
Yeah. If you're looking back on your career, say 10 years ago, you've done it. I mean, you've worked on some of the most prominent shows on TV. You're the showrunner of, I would say, one of the most highly anticipated shows of the year. What advice would you give to your younger self and to other young South Asians of how they can carve out this path in the way that you have?
Oh, wow. I'd say a couple of things. One is you have to be good to the people around you. It is incredibly important. And I've sometimes learned that the hard way. But the main thing is to trust people and to make sure that you're treating people with kindness and with a sense of sort of camaraderie. That's a big piece of advice I would give people. Kindness matters a lot.
Yeah.
I would also say that if there is a passion that you have and an interest that you have, really pay attention to it. Not that you'll get to do it all the time, but it will be the thing that if you carry it with you and you're able to express that passion, if anybody perchance asks you about it in an elevator or in an interview or whatever, it's a thing that will set you apart. If you feel strongly about something, figure out if you had your moment to talk to somebody about it, how would you talk about it?
Yeah.
I've always had things that have interested me, and I would say that to my mom, to a production assistant, to Diane Sawyer, to Jon Stewart, because it's the thing that I love that I can talk about to anybody. So really know what it is that interests you and figure out how you would tell that story. Be kind and gain skills. I would say gain skills from figuring out, in my world, it's how do you stack a show? How do you figure out how to hire people? How do you figure out what makes a good story? How do you manage talent? How do you, all kinds of things, get skills, because ultimately that is what people look for. And then the last thing I would say for me to my 10 years ago self is that I'm really interested in leadership. I'm really interested in what makes people good leaders. I really like the work of your boss right now. And she's been such a trailblazer in that field. And I've, looked up a lot of stuff that she said. But I think that particularly being for me an Indian American woman, I feel like I've been able to share stories when it's been really important and relevant, but then also be like, we're not all that different in times when that's been important to talk about.
Yeah.
I was born in India. I moved here when I was 8.5 years old, and I'm an immigrant. I think that spirit in my parents and in me has always made me pretty scrappy and pretty like a pit bull at times.
Yeah.
And I am so proud of my background and who I am. And it's been really sort of exciting to be able to talk about that from time to time in spaces where it matters. And yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing those nuggets of wisdom. And, I was reading this interview that you did recently about how you're creating this show from scratch and you're really trying to give an opportunity to diverse voices. And I can't tell you how appreciated that is because, to round out this conversation, we started about how you're unlikely, and it's because we don't see a lot of South Asians in this realm. So I feel really lucky to be chatting with you here today, and just know that you've got a whole community rooting for you and rooting for this show. And so excited to see where it all goes.
Thank you so much, Simi. And I love that you're doing this. What a cool idea for a podcast. And I just love it. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you want to get new episodes straight to your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.